Hi everybody, I'm Zilla Blitz and welcome. Today we're going to do a deep dive first look at 85 Afghanistan Graveyard of Empires, designed by Mark H. Walker and published by Flying Pig Games. Now this is the second game in Flying Pig Games' Squad Battle series. The first game, 65 Squad Battles in the Jungles of Vietnam, brought the conflict to Vietnam, of course. This game takes the conflict to Afghanistan, where we have Soviet forces going up against Afghani Mujahideen. As we can see here at the bottom of the screen, this is a card-driven tactical combat system that I think it's fair to say aims for mid-level complexity in tactical combat. Tactical combat games are often quite complex with a heavy rule set. This aims for a more fast-playing, easier to jump into experience. Let's do a quick overview of the game before we start to look at the components. Also, for people that are interested in solitaire, at the end of this video I'll be looking at Alone in the Mountains, which is the solo expansion for 85 Afghanistan. So stick around at the end of the video for that if you'd like to learn more about playing this game solitaire with that expansion. This is a 1 to 2 player game with gameplay listed as 1 to 4 hours depending upon the complexity of the scenario. And there are 8 scenarios in this game. Each turn represents a few minutes of real time, and so therefore if we do the math on that, the historical length of scenarios is probably 15 minutes to a half an hour type of experience here. Unit scale are squads and individual vehicles. There are individual helicopters in here, very much at the tactical level of experience. Let's jump in and take a look at our rulebook and scenarios book. There are 40 pages altogether, and the numbering stops, however, at page 24, and that's pretty much where the rules end, so we got a little bit more than 20 pages worth of rules. This is 8.5 by 11 white glossy paper, as you can probably tell a little bit by the reflection of the lighting here. And the back half of the rule book is pretty much all of the descriptions of the 8 scenarios, which range in length from 4 to 8 turns. Now, if we look through the rule book here, organization is pretty good. It's, you know, sometimes I wish for a little more highlighting and a little bit more visual clarity to the rule book, but it's, you know, it's functional, and reading through it, I've looked through most of the rules. Things seem clear. I really haven't had questions yet, although I always put the caveat on that you really don't know until you start to jump in and play the game. We do have some helpful graphics here. This one is for the line of sight. I'm going to talk a little bit about complexity. I feel like the complexity here, I would probably give this a 5 based on kind of the first go through of the rules here. Maybe a 4.5. I tend to lean towards a 5 because a lot of units have a number of powers or abilities, and I feel like those are going to ramp up the complexity a little bit. But certainly for a tactical level combat system, this is very accessible. So I think this is one of the more accessible tactical combat systems that I've looked at so far. I think this will be pretty easy to get up to speed with, and I think the games are going to play pretty fast. Now, to give you an idea then as to what's in the game, let's talk about some of the major mechanics and gameplay elements that are here. First up, it's very important to know this is a card-driven game. Each player is going to have a hand of 4 cards, and in an impulse they're going to play one of those cards, and we'll take a look at how that works as we look at the cards themselves. Transport is modeled, so certain vehicles allow you to be able to transport infantry units. Stacking is 3 ground units to a hex, so a very light stacking rule system here. And there are no support weapons in this game. There are support weapons in the Alone in the Mountains module. We'll take a look at those when we get to that. But in the base core game here, there aren't support weapons modeled. So again, one of the places where the game simplifies tactical combat a little bit to make it more accessible and to play quickly. Now, in that 3 unit stacking rule, there can be 3 ground units there, one of which can be a hero and 2 non-heroes. And you're also limited to 1 ground vehicle per hex. There can also be an air unit in a hex, and you're limited to 1 air unit in a hex. So a very light stacking system. I feel like it's going to be a game that visually is going to be really easy to parse as you're playing the game. Line of sight and ranged fire, as you would expect, are modeled in the game. Also, assault combat is modeled, which would say, you know, when units are in the same hex and going at each other that way in close combat, that's what's called assault combat in the game. We have vehicles as tanks and things like that, so there are both soft targets and hard targets. So we have high explosive fire and armor-piercing fire. Opportunity fire is modeled in the game. Artillery as well is modeled, but it's card-based, not unit-based. So basically going to use a card to call in artillery strikes on the board. There is a rally system and a shaken system there. Helicopters are the air units that are modeled in the game, and there are also fortifications, and yes, I almost forgot, heroes are modeled as well in this game system. So that gives you an idea of the key mechanics that are in the game. And overall, again, I would say this is probably a 5, maybe a 4.5. I'll know more when we play it in terms of complexity. Let's jump in now and take a look at our counter sheets. There are 4 of them in the game, and these counters are big. We have one sheet of 1.35 inch counters that are used for the vehicles, and that's what we're looking at now. We can see the red counters here are the Russian counters, and green are the Afghani, probably representing captured Russian vehicles, I would guess here. We can see we've got two, we could cut these up into two different types. We've got our helicopters, of which there's two different types. Then we have our tanks, trucks, and some armored personnel carriers in here. And again, tanks and armored personnel carriers for the Afghani forces here. But nice big counters. Now these are double-sided as we look at them. All of them are double-sided. And we can see that the helicopters here have a damage stat, but the vehicles are destroyed on hits. So you're either going to be okay or you're going to get blown up as we look at these. So those are our bigger counters. There are 32 of those altogether. And then we've got 189 1-inch counters. And these two big counters printed on both sides. There is a reduced state, kind of a shaken state, not a shaken state, but a reduced depleted state for ground units here. On these are represented by those white bars on the units. But if we look across here, we can see the top again, we have the Russian units, and the bottom we have the green Afghani units. Now, I mentioned earlier as we were talking about mechanics in the game that there aren't support weapon counters per se, but just to clarify on that too, some of these units have support weapon capacities built into them. So for example, we can look down here and see these RPG units here. These have an armor-piercing capability to fire those rocket-propelled grenades and things like that. Then we have some heavier machine guns in here and some anti-tank weapons as well. This has armor-piercing capacity. This DSHK unit has some armor-piercing capacity, and it's got spraying fire. So kind of automatic weapons and support weapons are built into these teams, and they're included in the game. So it's a misnomer to say that there aren't support weapons in the game. It's just those capacities are built into the core game, while they're provided as individual counters in the Alone in the Mountains advanced version. Let's take a quick look at this Spetsnaz, this Russian Spetsnaz, just walk through what the different things are on the counters, because I think too, they speak to a really interesting element of the game that we haven't really talked about yet. So we have hard targets and soft targets. And so this is an infantry unit. In the top left corner, we can see an asterisk. That's where if there were a target modifier for armor, that would where it go. But because this is a soft target, that doesn't factor into play for this one. Then on the left side, right beside that, we have these two icons, the star and then the red assault rifle kind of thing. The knife actually is what it is. These represent where abilities go for units. These are things like assault and assault plus, sniper, can't move and can't fire at the same time, spraying fire, elite status, pathfinder status, or difficult target or fanatic, that provide different capacities and capabilities for these units. So the Spetsnaz here, we see it's got the star, which means it's an elite unit, and then it's got assault plus capacity here to it. So it's a stronger assault unit in close combat. Then if we go down to the bottom left, we have the AP modifier on defense, and we can see this again. This is a soft target, so there's no number there for the Spetsnaz unit. Then the top right is the armor piercing capacity of the unit. Again, nothing because this doesn't have armor piercing capacity. The middle on the right side is where we get into this unit's attack factor. This is the high explosive factor. In the middle right here, we can see for the Spetsnaz is a 2. And then the bottom right, 3L, is the movement and what type it is. Leg being for the L stands for leg there. Then the only thing left that we haven't talked about is the middle bottom, which is much like the abilities. There are 12 of these, and these are called powers. These two give the units kind of unique characteristics and unique capacities. They can be things like leadership, marksmanship, conceal, which means the unit's able to conceal itself better, prep fire, rapid fire, resilient, deadly shot, explosive rounds, and things. So brutal is another one too here. And this one we can see the Spetsnaz, the skull and crossbones, is brutal, which gives it even more capacity in assault combat. So again, the combination of powers and abilities really take these generic combat factors and numbers, if you would, that are that are prevalent on the counters, and turn them into more abilities and capacities that really, I think, have shown that the game has taken a lot of consideration as to how to build out these units in ways that provide unique capacities in combat. So kind of fun to look at. Let's continue on though. We've looked at the other side here. Third counter sheet is where we start to get into a lot of the markers. Concealed markers, hover marker for helicopters, wire. We've got bunkers down here, and the rest of the Afghani ground units here. And then our fourth counter sheet here is more counters, more markers basically, fired, and then rubble. And we've got OPS complete for marking which units have taken their actions and things like that. The other side of the counters have more markers for them. So we've got shaken status. We talked about that. Breach, smoke, and then moved. And then likewise, the other side of the The counter sheet number 3 has some barrage counters on here too, the initiative marker, some more moved, fired, and foxhole markers as well. So a good set of, I think, a varied markers and units to kind of build out the scenarios. We mentioned early on that this is a card-driven game, so let's take a look at our cards. Now, in the core game, there are 2 different types of cards. We are looking at the smaller deck right now. There are 11 of these. These are bonus victory conditions. Certain scenarios have bonus victory conditions where you card draws that you pick one of these. It's going to vary per scenario to add a little bit of variety and a little bit of a kind of a dramatic twist to some of the scenarios. These are things like destroy an enemy vehicle using assault combat. Play before the scenario setup, remove 1 rifle unit from your allocated forces. This will give you victory points, but you're going to be playing at a handicap. Over here in the top right, it's reconstitute 1 unit. The other ones are for destroying different things. Eliminate an enemy sniper. Destroy 2 enemy units by using the panic action card. So just little things to kind of create a little twist of action in each scenario as it plays out. The vast majority of cards in the game, however, are what are called action cards, and that's what we're looking at right now. And they serve, I guess we could say, 4 functions in the game if we count the 2 unique cards that are on the right, and we'll talk about those momentarily. But most of the action cards have 2 actions at the top and then 2 different boxes here for helping out with combat down on the bottom. And each impulse in a turn, you're going to have 4 cards in your hand. And if you want to play one of these cards, you can pick one of the 2 actions, and then it plays out on a unit. Then at the end of that impulse, you draw back up to 4 cards, so you can be ready for your next turn. So we can see here some of the actions that these cards enable: scout, grenades, move and fire, rally, reinforcements, critical hit, bullet storm, glancing shot, bloodlust, and reload and fire. And some of these are interrupt actions and other things, but most of them are actions that you're going to be taking when it is your turn to act in an impulse. So quite a variety of things here. There's more than what we're showing here as well. So kind of combining what you want to do with your available card set is going to be a big part of the game. Now, if we take a look at the boxes down below the actions, these 2 boxes serve 2 different things. The left here is the targeting number. This is a targeting number that's used to determine whether an armor-piercing attack hits a target. Then the bottom right has a large number 2. This is actually the armor-piercing fire bonus, which determines whether your attack actually succeeded and destroyed your armored target. Then in the top right of this bottom right box, we have hit in green and red, and I think sometimes they're in yellow too. This is the high explosive factor, the high explosive attack calculation matrix. So you're basically going to come up with a number in a high explosive attack that's going to allow you to draw a certain number of cards depending upon what that number is, and you're looking to draw like a green hit or a red hit. And if you get one of those cards, that means that particular that high explosive fire actually did some damage to the target, and you can do more of those in stages. So it's kind of a fast-moving, very unique kind of combat resolution system that I think once you get used to it, it's going to play really quickly and give a good variety of results. Now, there are 2 other things that the action cards do, and these are based on these unique cards on the right-hand side. The first one here is this event card. There are 4 of these, and notice that it just says event 3. Most of the scenarios will have unique events that happen inside of them depending upon the scenario. So they are scenario dependent, but if you pull or draw this event 3 card, when that happens, that triggers that particular event in the scenario booklet that you then act out. So it's a kind of a neat way to have a generic card create some unique content in a particular scenario. Then the end turn card, there are 4 of these in the action card deck, and scenarios will call for a certain number of these to be inserted in the deck at the beginning of each turn, and basically that turn ends when you hit that required number of end turn cards as you've drawn it. Now again, you might be drawing these cards for combat resolution and things like that, so I get a sense this deck is going to expire pretty quickly as you go through it. But if you have 3 of these, once you draw your 3rd end turn card, that particular turn ends. So you don't really know how long a particular turn is going to last in a game, creating another kind of dynamic tension element in gameplay. Let's take a look at our player aids. For a tactical combat game, there are very few, which gives an idea again for how they're trying to streamline play with this system. We have 2 player aids, one of which has 2 sides and one of which is single-sided. This is our terrain effects chart, which is much as like what you would expect in any type of a tactical combat game. And then this is the sum of our terrain, of our basically our charts and tables. We've got an AP range modifiers in terms of what that is, then high explosive range modifiers, ranged combat soft target fire resolution, which basically tells you which types of hit cards you're looking to pull out of there, then AP to hit modifiers. And that's it for our charts and tables in this game. So very, very light reliance on charts, tables. You won't be looking up a lot of stuff. It's all driven by those cards. Let's take a look now at our other single-sided sequence of play player aid, and let's walk through just what the sequence of play is to get a sense for how things play out, because it's a pretty straightforward sequence of play. At the beginning of each turn, you're going to deal out your cards, determine initiative, then you're going to conduct impulses. And this is really the heart of the game, where you're going to have 4 cards in your hand. You're going to pick one of those cards to play. You're going to go back and forth amongst your opponents, always pulling up to 4 cards before it's your turn to have an impulse. And then when you hit those certain number of end turn markers, that turn ends. Then you hit the reserve phase, which allows you to move units that haven't really acted yet in a limited way throughout the turn. Then after that, you go to the cleanup phase, and that turn is complete. So relatively straightforward. I mean, it's a very kind of elegant and streamlined tactical combat system. Now let's come to the fun part of almost every time we do a first look. Let's take a look at our maps. These are, the Afghan 85 uses a map tile system. There are 5 of these tiles in the game. We'll take a look at each one of them in turn. They're 12 inches on the vertical here, and then 17 inches wide. And they're geomorphic, so you can butt them up against each other to create a wide range of terrain elements. Now, in addition to the 5 map tiles, the game also comes with these kind of terrain tiles that fit on top of the map. So if we punch out, for example, this woods, we could drop this on one of the hexes. It fills up the hexes completely, and you could create even more variety with your scenarios based on this. We've got destroyed buildings, some foliage here, looks like some rough terrain, some a brush maybe, some craters, and then the other side has even greater variety, some flat terrain if you want to take some of the rough terrain out. Rubble and things like that too. So you can build up even more map situations using these extra hex tiles that fit on top of these. Now each hex again is 2 inches wide, the counters are 1 inch, and the vehicles are 1.35 inches. So this is a game that plays out at a relatively large scale. That's our first map one, the kind of the most bland of them all. It's nice to have one that's completely blank for some simple scenarios. Then we get here, one that's got some hills on the side. We've got some roads in here, some buildings, kind of a field over there, some rubble over here, different environments. And again, capturing kind of that, I think, that arid feeling that you have in Afghanistan. Some more hilly terrain with this one, nice big tall area in the beginning here, in the middle central area of this. And if we go on, we can see that we have more this kind of a road with some rough terrain, some brush and things like that, providing some light cover. And then our last one here, a full-blown Afghani village. Some walls and things, central area here, buildings all around. Some interesting kind of semi-urban combat available for this one. And again, these all butt up against each other to form a variety of different terrain tiles. And with that, we've taken a look at all the components of the 85 Afghanistan Graveyard of Empires core game. Let's move on now to a quick look at Alone in the Mountains, which is the solitaire module you could buy as a separate add-on expansion to the core game for 85 Afghanistan. So here's what comes in the box with 85 Alone in the Mountains. We've got a rulebook with scenarios in here. We've got 2 player aids, another one additional map for us, and then a counter sheet, and then a deck of cards to control the AI bot in the game. Let's start out by taking a look at our rules and scenario book. Much like the core rule set, this is carved up into 2 big halves. We have the first 11 pages, which are the rules itself. Now, I think this is going to ramp up the complexity of the game overall, because you've got to understand the rules for the solo system and the AI bot and the card deck that's there. But it's not a heavy lift here. This is a relatively straightforward read, I thought, in terms of how this plays out. We do have then in the middle of this 2 pages really of a solo example of play, which is really helpful. I always like to see these. Then the back half largely of the solo manual are the scenarios. Now, this is a very important thing to note about the solo bot and the solo system in Alone in the Mountains. First up, there are 6 scenarios, and these are scenarios that are specifically designed to play with the solo bot. This solo system isn't a system-wide system. It's a solo module that allows you to play these particular 6 scenarios in this particular order or way. You can play them in any order, but it suggests playing them in this order because they're kind of part of a story as you go through them. So, and furthermore too, the solo bot is designed to play one specific side in the scenario. So you can't play both sides with the solo bot in the scenario. So for example, scenario 1 here, a peaceful place, allows you to play the Soviet. If you're playing it solo, the Soviet player is the player and the Mujahideen player is the solo bot. You can't flip that and play it the other way. So that's an important distinction to make here with this solo system, that it's a solo system specifically for these scenarios that allow you to play through these kind of semi-linked scenarios here, at least in terms of story, but playing them from one particular side, not both sides. So it's a limited system. It's more like you're buying it for the story and the expansion to play through these scenarios here. Let's take a look now at our counter sheet. As we mentioned in the original first look of the core game, support weapons are kind of baked into the capacities of the units here. In the expansion module, we do get some individual support weapons, things like RPDs and then Type 50 PPSs and stuff like that. And if we flip over these, we can see these units are, these counters, as with the core game, they are double-sided as well. So we add in some RPGs and some satchel charges. Now, also looking at these, we can see these units that have these symbols, triangles, the black triangles, black circles, red circles, green circles, etc. This is basically how the solo system works. So at the beginning of a scenario, you're going to be putting down some of these kind of concealed positions that are going to represent the concealed positions of your enemy. And then as you pull cards out, it's going to activate certain symboled systems, and those units, then you're going to use the cards to determine what actions these units can take depending upon their combat stance. And we'll see that more as we dig into the cards a little bit. But basically it uses a symbol system to determine which of your enemy units is going to activate. And then those units can also go to a revealed status, which we can see on the other side. And that's where you kind of start placing in the actual unit that you're going to be fighting against. We do have some extra markers down here for target and then fired and ops complete and things like that. Here is a look at the heart of the solo system in the game. These are this deck of cards that you're going to pull when it's time for your enemy to move here, your solo enemy to move. We can see the symbols in the top right that are going to designate which units take an action in a particular impulse. Then at the top we have a stance. Depending upon whether your opponent has an offensive, a skirmish, or a defensive stance, that's going to dictate what action takes place. So move, fire, or fire. And then once you know that, you come down here. If the unit's firing, you get some instructions on what the target is. In this case, in the bottom left, it's nearest. And then what the result happens to be, this is used for combat resolution. If the result was to move, it tells you what to do and move to the objective in a brash fashion and things like that. And the rule book and the rules help distinguish what those are. You also might have some random events and be using these for random events in the game as well. And these are listed here. So it's a relatively straightforward, simple kind of algorithmic system that determines what your opponent's going to do in Alone in the Mountains. Alone in the Mountains does come with 2 player aids as well, a random events player aid. Then this side has the solo bot decision matrix, which is kind of an explanation of the algorithm and how it works, which looks very handy. This is an explanation of the solo bot cards in terms of being a handy reference, so you don't have to dig into the rule book for that. And then lastly, we have solitaire reminders. So some helpful reminders that are common things that people might need reminders of as they're playing the game. And lastly, we get 1 additional map tile with the system, and this is 12 by 17 with 2-inch hexes to fit in with the others. I mean, this has water on it. It's a little bit more lush than all of the other tiles in the core game, so it doesn't really match up along this wide side. It does match up fairly well along the tops and the bottoms, however, to be somewhat geomorphic with the other maps in the core game. Before we wrap up, let's take a moment to talk about the solitaire ratings and the complexity of both the core game and the expansion. As we mentioned in the core section here, I'd say this is a 4.5 to a 5 in terms of complexity. I think solitaire, this is probably more like a 5. The card play is going to, because you can, playing both ways in the core game, you're going to be able to know what your opponent's cards are, and some of that deceptiveness with cards, I think, is a big part of this game. Knowing what your opponent has, if you know those cards, it's going to take it down a notch. Still think it's going to work pretty well, though. I'd give it a 5 out of 10. For our expansion for solo, I'd say a 10 out of 10. It's designed for solo, and depending on how the solo bot works, I think this could be a really fun system to play through those 6 scenarios and things. Complexity-wise, I'd probably bump it up from a 4.5 to a 5 to a 5 to a 5.5, because you have to fold in the complexity of the solitaire system in addition to the core rule set. And there you have it, a first look at 85 Afghanistan Graveyard of Empires and its solo module, Alone in the Mountains. I will be bringing some gameplay of this game to the channel at some point in the future, so look for that video. In the meantime, if you want to see another Flying Pig game in action, we've got a full replay of A Most Fearful Sacrifice, and I'll put the link to that here if you'd like to take a look at that. Thanks for watching, everybody. Have a great day.